So today we are here with Monika. Monika has been iOS developer for over 8 years and currently works as a senior staff engineer at ChargePoint. She has worked in different kinds of teams, from being the solo iOS developer in a company of 10 to a group of 12 iOS developers. She enjoys taking an idea from rough inception to final production deployment. She still loves coding after so many years, and she's thankful about that. So also we are thankful for her to doing this session today with us. So I will give you, Monika, the lead, and I will be here through the session if you need any help.
Okay, thank you so much, Selen. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll it's kind of funny to hear about yourself. Yeah. Okay, so we basically left the last session that we were going to start on chapter 4, I believe. Sometimes it gets hidden, like what. So basically this is state management, and that's kind of a very important part of SwiftUI, mainly because, as we kind of discussed, is that instead of us going and updating the UI ourselves when the state of the app changes, we've basically kind of declared to SwiftUI which data could change. And then when that data does change, then SwiftUI, if the view is dependent on it, that view would change. And I think this is the coolest part of SwiftUI, what makes it, work as a reactive framework. But it's also, I feel like it's one of the more confusing aspects of SwiftUI if you've been more doing things, as they say, imperatively, where you kind of go and update everything, and the UI doesn't just magically change for you. So here we go. So these are just kind of like some of the highlights, and please feel free to sort of speak up as as we're kind of going over like some of the main points or anything that sort of you had questions about. So I sort of have highlighted some aspects of the book. So here, it was talking about like SwiftUI provides 2 complementary tools that ensures you can freely manage and update your data model while making sure the UI is always in sync. And that's the main thing. It's in sync with the data model. Both mechanisms build on property wrappers. The first one helps you define your data model in such a way that it's capable of publishing its state. And we're going to get to that. And secondly, SwiftUI manages the state of the UI for you in a memory area that only SwiftUI has control over. So you can't go do things yourself. But the main thing is you use these property wrappers to specify, your data model to SwiftUI that this data model does change, its state will change. And also, for more complicated models, like which properties we want to publish their state when they're changing. So the next thing is that, we've a lot of like tutorials when you do SwiftUI. The first one that you're sort of have some, you actually kind of go and have some exposure to is add state or add binding. Can someone explain, like here, basically, it was saying that if the data you want to display in a view is an enum, struct, or a simple type, you can either use add state or add binding. Can someone explain like what's the difference between when we use add state versus add binding? While they were reading. And please just speak up if you.
Basically, the difference lies in the ownership of the data.
So if
Yes.
something has been declared with add state, that means that view owns that piece of
Yes.
information. If not, if it is defined with the property wrapper binding, that means something else owns it, but you have also got the privilege to change it.
Yes, that's exactly. And they gave a really good example here. So they had one which I thought was kind of helpful. So you see here, you have a struct parent view, and it has an add state, variable, this favorite number. And what it does is that it's passing this favorite number to its child view. Okay. And the child view has that number, but as add binding, because it didn't, it doesn't own it, but it is, that is passed to it. And the main thing is that once we tell SwiftUI that this is add binding, it knows that it can update, it can change. So here, the number, the dollar number is passed into the stepper. And when you were putting this dollar number basically in a view, it knows that it'll use its value to display. But then for this particular view, which is a stepper, if the user goes and changes the value, then that number's value will change to, basically reflect what the user has changed. So again, the add state is at the point that you're sort of like declare and setting the value. And then, add binding is for any dependent view, like this child view, which basically gets that it's going to be passed in that value, but it's allowed to also change it. And the other main thing was that, add state, we're using it when we have kind of like simple property types, as it mentioned. Any questions about this? Because I know it's like, and then, some of the things that I highlighted, like both add state and add binding are best suited for managing the local UI state. So it's kind of like at the point in the view that it's kind of for its view and maybe its child views, it's going to depend on the specific data. Then it's, declares it at state, and, the text field changes it, then it gets updated and might pass it to a child view that might use it to update its view, but it's mostly local. And then this was interesting. However, you should avoid using add state or add binding for complex objects that you want to persist on disk or send across the network. SwiftUI has more powerful tools to manage objects, and that's where we're going to get to the next sort of property wrapper. And that's basically, it's one of these. So we use add state object, add observed object, and add environment object. And it's like, so many, so many different property wrappers. So after reading the book, does anyone know, what an add state object, what's the difference between add state object and an add state? When would we use add state objects?
I think it was when you want to make sure your view, it's basically when you have a state object in the view, you want your data to be created only once. So if like the user changes something on UI, that reference object with the state object prefix is not created again, so the user doesn't lose their
and that was something that I didn't, I hadn't paid attention to it that much, and in this book it kind of brought it up. So I guess the main thing is there is this protocol for observable objects. So when we are using state object or observed object, there is this protocol that they're, basically they can be observed, so And we're going to talk about like when we're creating these things, we have to make sure that it's actually extending that particular protocol to let SwiftUI know that it's can be observed. But yeah, for add state object, SwiftUI handles the life cycle of the underlying object, making sure it will be created once, even if SwiftUI has to recreate the entire view in response. And that kind of makes sense when, you know, where would this kind of matter? So they gave this example that, you know, you had this counter class and it's an observable object. Again, in order for us to be able to know its state changes, we have to extend the observable object for that particular, whatever class that we're going to use. And then also specify which of the properties their state changes we're going to publish. You know, in this case, like count is something that's going to be published. And if someone basically has this, you know, class as a state object. So here in the state stepper, we have the state counter and it's a state object. Somebody else joined. So we created here, notice that we create this counter. And then we're passing it. So we have like, you know, there's a stepper that's using the count of the state counter. Great. So if they, you know, the count changes, the stepper will get updated. Now we kind of noticed that in here in the content view, which is kind of the parent view of the state stepper, it has actually a state stepper and it has this color picker. And the interesting thing is that it itself in this content view has color as a state. And if the user goes in the color picker and changes the color, we know that because, you know, it's dependent on the state of the color, this entire view, so this entire view here will be refreshed. You can think of that. But the interesting part is that this state counter is not going to be reset. It's not going to be recreated. So once it was, you know, instantiated and there's a state counter, SwiftUI knows to keep it, you know, and when the UI gets refreshed, this part doesn't get basically reinstantiated. And that's kind of the main thing, because if that wasn't possible, then you can imagine, and every time the user changes the color, then that counter is going to get reset. And then you're going to get this weird behavior where, you know, you see that the stepper is resetting, and that wouldn't be good. So in the cases where, you know, you're basically, you're part of a set of views, then you want to make sure that you're actually using state object to make sure that if your view is getting re-rendered, that this doesn't get reset. And that was something kind of, I guess, before when I was just doing some examples, I wasn't aware of this distinction between add state object and what we're going to look at as the observable object. Any questions about this? So the observed object, I should say. And then basically, you know, we're told here that when you need to listen to changes or updates in an observable object, you use a state object. And then you create the instance you want to listen to in the view itself. And that's the main thing, because, you know, it's a local, you're creating it in the view. Sometimes you actually create these, you know, a state object or observed object, in the app, and then you're passing it in the constructors of these views. And then obviously it's already created once on the top app. And then if the views get, refreshed, that doesn't matter. It won't be, it won't be reinstantiated. But, if you actually need to create it in a specific view, then you want to make sure that you use a state object instead of an observed object. Any questions about that? Because it is kind of subtle. And then we're kind of given a similar example now using an observed object. So here, we have this observed object. So here we create that counter again. The counter is an observable object. And then we have the same thing that, we have our content view, which creates the VStack with the observed stepper. And then you have the color picker. And this is where the weird thing happens, that every time you change the color, it's the counter resets, because it's going to, refresh the observed stepper too. And then basically at that point, it's basically recreates that counter instance. And he was mentioning that in the first release of SwiftUI, observed object was the only way to create and observe an object inside the view. But then we had the state object introduced. But again, you could use observed object if it's created outside of the view and it's just passed into the view. That is totally okay, and it will work fine. It's just that, if it's created in a view, then you're going to have this side effect that, if it gets refreshed, then it will recreate the instance. And let's see, when should we use the observed object? When you need to listen to changes and updates in an observed object, okay, similar to the state object. And the object you want to observe in the view is not created by the view, but outside of the view, like in a parent view or an app struct. And then it does make me think, well, at that point, why not just use add state object? If it is, by not a specific view. I guess this would be the case where, we would have it be created in an app struct, where then that would make sense that you just have an observed object created. Any questions about this? And then we get to the fun one, which is the more interesting one, and that's the add environment object property wrapper. And that's the one that I think a lot of apps do use for some of their data models. And that's because till now, if you wanted to use a certain data model whose state changes in all the the child views, you have to kind of pass that as part of the constructor of the child view. And that can get very clunky if you have multiple hierarchy like child views, where you have to kind of pass it in. And it's possible that the intermediary views may not even need it. And a good example that he gives is that basically we have this case with a user profile, where not all the views need to display or use the user profile or update it. So if we have to kind of pass it into all the intermediary views, that gets very clunky. So it makes sense that we actually set it in an environment object. And as long as that environment object is set in the, and whoever is like the parent view, and then all the subsequent child views have access to that environment object. And I think this was the case where, this was the one that Chaitra noticed, that we had this navigation view, and it, has this setting screen, child, and it's basically, we're setting the environment object on the navigation view rather than inside on the setting screen. And, it wasn't very clear, like, if you set it inside, then you don't have access to all the children of whatever other views that are going to be inside the setting screen, that you actually have to set it on the navigation view. And I don't think there was any really good explanation. Chaitra, did you feel like you understood why that was happening, other than maybe this could be a little bug on SwiftUI?
So if you define the environment object view modifier on setting screen, that object is available only to setting screen and its children.
And its children, yes.
Yeah. So within setting screen, if you have a navigation link and you push a new screen onto the navigation view, that is not its child, but its peer.
Yes.
So that object will not be available. And as he said, I don't know whether it's in the link or in the textbook, the app crashes if you do that.
Yes, which is even worse. It's one thing if it wasn't working, but yeah, I mean, again, because you don't have SwiftUI just magically does some of these things with it, if it suddenly doesn't have access to that data model or whatever. And actually, there's another interesting thing about environment objects that, at the time that we're compiling, it wouldn't know if you set it, if any of these views have access to it or not. It's kind of like, and that's dangerous at times, because if you don't set it and then you try to retrieve it, poof, you're going to get a crash. But I guess in some weird way, I guess it makes sense, because in that case with the navigation link, then whatever view we're pushing kind of isn't exactly a child, it's sort of like, it's something like in parallel to whatever view it was. So the navigation view would be the parent for that view that we push. So that kind of makes sense. But at the same time, it's easy to not think of it that way, right? Because you're sort of going, oh, yeah, I mean, setting screen is where I'm going to be pushing it. Why would I do it, in the navigation view? So it's nice that he actually highlighted that, because he could have come up with a simpler example to show. And I saw a bunch of other examples that, they just show how you can, set it on the parent view and all the child views to get it. But this is, again, this is a good example that at times, for certain data in your app, this would be a nice way to pass it, because, you don't necessarily want to go through this clunky way of passing it through all these constructors. But at the same time, you have to be careful, especially most apps, you're going to have these navigations and things being pushed into the navigation to properly set that. And again, the other thing that he does mention, that it's worth noting that this approach has a serious drawback, that the compiler has no way to check if you injected an observable object into the environment before trying to fetch it using the environment object. And when trying to retrieve an object from an environment that doesn't exist, your app will crash with a runtime error, which is kind of severe. to say the least. Yeah.
That one's interesting. I feel like, should we make that object an optional then if somehow it doesn't exist? Like,
well, it is kind of, I mean, that's something that Apple decided. They do make certain decisions about something. If they don't feel like you should be ever in that kind of a state, then they always, want you to crash instead of, well, with some optional stuff, it's kind of like, well, you may have set it, you may not. It's okay. Once we say something is optional, we're saying it's okay for it not to be set. But in this case, I guess they prefer, and this is always an interesting argument with, when you are getting these runtime errors, that it's better if your app fails and you find earlier on that you don't have that properly, set, then, you kind of sort of in a hidden way sort of dealing with it, which is probably not a good thing, because, then you're not always aware that, we should have, like, for instance, set that environment in the navigation view, and that was what was the bug, and that's why it wasn't passed in properly. But then this really does mean that you have to test. If you're going to use these environment objects, then you have to really test your app for all the different flows, because it's possible that if you're not, setting it properly, maybe one happy flow looks right, and then for other things it doesn't, depending on, all the different ways you can get to all the screens in your app. So and so for environment object, you use it when you need to listen to changes and updates in observed objects, and when you have to pass an observed object through several views that don't need this object before it reaches the view that you do need to access. So that would be a good case when you would do it. And I don't know how any of you guys already use SwiftUI in a production app?
We do, yeah.
And do you guys use environment objects?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we use more observed object. I'll have to dig into the code, but I've seen a lot of observed object usage.
Interesting.
Environment object you would use if it is like, if that object is pervasive, like you're using in like a complete flow. For example, if you see the corresponding property wrapper environment for simple types, Apple uses it for telling us what size of the screen is, what kind of, is it a dark mode or light mode? So it's more like for global settings, right? So based along those lines, you can extend it to your own objects, environment object. Is there some piece of information you want available for all your screens? Or a particular flow in a screen, like for onboarding, then put it in the environment object.
I see.
Otherwise, if it is something you want to pass explicitly from one screen to another, then use observed object. So based on
that makes sense.
You would choose one or the other.
Yeah, I could see that there's certain, as you were mentioning, and Apple does it for its own certain system environments that you would want to have that accessible through all the views, and it's too clunky to actually have that be something that gets passed in. It should be something that's just available. It gets set on the top app. But yeah, I mean, I've only used SwiftUI for when we wrote our widget, and it really, for that case, we weren't using state objects, because the way widgets, home screen widgets work in iOS, that it kind of loads up your widget, and then you can grab whatever data you do, and then it kind of sets the UI. And then it's kind of static that way. until the next time it goes and fetches something, and then it itself goes and reloads your widget UI, so you don't have to, it doesn't. But we're thinking of now using SwiftUI for some other screens, so then that gets very interesting. And in terms of so we kind of paid attention to the and then of course once we're going to go and look at combine, one side of it is basically saying that you have these different ways of representing your data model in the views, but another one is actually having your data model, making sure that it extends this observable object and publishing all the properties to it. So that's, especially if you had an app where it wasn't initially used for SwiftUI, then it means that you have to go and update your models to make that be observable. So it's a little bit of a change. Any bugs or issues you guys have faced when using this kind of a state model, or any inefficiencies that you've seen? It's been pretty, it works as advertised.
It works, yeah. Only when SwiftUI, the first version, came up, as he mentions, state object was not there. So
right.
object was being used for all reference types. For simple types like int and all those things, we used to use state.
Yes, that's what I remember. I remember we were doing some stuff in that hackathon or earlier on that I just remember everything was at state, or
Yeah. So once state object came in, it became so easy. So if you're using networking,
yes,
it is so easy to maintain the life cycle of the object behind the UI using a state object and using add published variables.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's and that's why I got excited with using this book, because the one side of it is specifying that you have these, state, there's the state management, there's a state object. And then the other side is, okay, your app is going to go and fetch things from the network and update things. And how do you, kind of subscribe and get notified in a nice, simple way. Which I'm hoping Combine, offers, but we shall see. So it looks like you were pretty much done with chapter 4, unless others had anything else that, they wanted to go over. So the next, and this is where we kind of, so chapter 5, and let me just kind of go and we look at, where's the content? So, chapter 5 sort of goes over displaying data in list, which, this is so common that, you can't avoid them. And it does a good sort of review of, how lists work, how you can, kind of put other views in lists. He even gives you an example, which I thought it was kind of funny, that I think it was the one for searching dynamic lists. Yeah, and then, asynchronously fetching data and updating. And he actually kind of gives you a little exposure to how you can do the whole await async fetches, which is something we're going to be doing more in other chapters, but I guess he thought it would be a good example of showing how that kind of how do you sort of dynamically update the content of the list. So I think given that given that now we know all about like what a state object is, and then this part doesn't seem as hard to understand. And he does throw, I have to say, he does throw the whole notion of view model and a little bit of MVVM that probably, he doesn't really go over what that is or how that works, but he just sort of throws, here's like, I'm going to show you an example with a view model and, update. And I think it was here. But anyways, I think a bunch of you haven't gone through those chapters, but I was thinking, and you can let me know that maybe for next week, we can kind of cover chapter 5 and chapter 6. And the reason I'm sort of like hurrying through this is that there is a lot of stuff there. But, the crux of the whole book is more using, learning how to use combine and also async and await. So we can always kind of go back to, like, I think the main reason he's covering list and input form is that so you have familiarity with this, with how they sort of work in SwiftUI. And then when he gives examples for the other parts, then, you sort of, he's going to give actual sample applications, simple ones that going to use that. And then it won't be so novel. But at the same time, we don't have to know every detail for this stuff before we can kind of move in to how, we can use the asynchronous stuff for it. But I wanted to know how you guys feel. Do you prefer we just do, chapter 5 next week and then chapter 6 the subsequent week? Or are you guys okay with doing both chapters next week? And I'm open for any ideas. I open up the chats or anyone.
I think Farhana wrote like chapter 5 and 6 for the next week works for me. So if anybody wants to react,
yeah,
they can use the reaction button.
I think last time nobody had like a poll, so we can do that too.
Yes.
But it just basically it is kind of yeah. I mean, usually what I do, I kind of like read through it and run the sample apps, if there's certain things that, he's highlighting. But it is, I have to say, there is a lot of information there. And part of it is that, we're not totally, I mean, we can do a whole book just on SwiftUI and all the cool things that you could do in terms of UI, rendering different things. And but this one is kind of like, more like, how do you like populate these, how do you use the state management on top of this asynchronous stuff? So that's kind of the meat of the book. So it looks like folks are good with that.
Yes, we have a couple of responses.
Yeah, some people might be shy, don't want to rock the boat.
No problem.
But what we can do is just kind of highlight the main aspects. And I would suggest that, if you have time, try to read through both chapters. But if you don't, we'll highlight those important things anyways. And then we'll move on.
I think that's it for today, right, Monika?
Yeah. I think that, we'll try it. And then if suddenly, there's more to do, we can always, change again. But
if you have any questions,
I'm just really excited to get into Combine just because I'm like, yes, I read a little bit about it before and did one little tutorial, but it's always good. And that's why I was so happy when I saw this book. And now Chaitri showed another book too, because for the async stuff, because there's just not a lot about that. So there's a lot of books about SwiftUI, but once you start, there's like two parts to when you're doing app development. One is like rendering this UI that looks good. But the other part is, unless, your app is just very static, you're going to be fetching things from the network. There's going to be a lot of state changes. And it's just nice to know like what's a good way to do that in SwiftUI. So, because that's kind of what makes your app dynamic and, powerful. So that's why I'm excited. All right. Any other comments or anything? I mean, we can just end the session a little early, give everyone a little more time. But if anything you guys want to go over, please let me know.
If you have any questions, also you can just unmute yourself or just write it through the
Yeah,
chat.
feel free. This is a supportive environment. We're all learning.
Yes.
And everyone's good for next Friday? All good? Yeah, I think we've had really good participation and attendance, which is really exciting.
Yes.
I hope we kind of keep the momentum. This is why I wanted to do this with a group, because it always makes me feel like I'm sort of, making the time, because work comes and you're always busy and you're doing some ugly Objective-C corner or something else. And it's just nice to like, okay, but I have like some time to, learn new things and try stuff. So it's always good. All
Thank you
right.
so much, Monika.
No problem. And it was great to spend another Friday morning or other time zone with all of you. And see you next Friday.
Thank you, Monika.
See you all then.
Take care.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah.
See
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Take
See you.
care.
Bye.